everybody, and thanks to our friends from Hudson Institute for providing all the goodies. So welcome to our third panel. This is on the Chinese Communist Party's involvement in higher education and on university campuses. Again, some of those themes have already, and topics have already been mentioned in our first two panels, but now we're going to do a deeper dive. This panel is moderated by Isaac Stonefish, who's all the way on my right. His larger bio, like everybody else, is in the handout that you got. So let me just say a couple of quick highlights. Isaac is an international affairs journalist. He is a contributing columnist to the Washington Post Global Opinions. He's also a senior fellow at the Asia Society Center for U.S.-China Relations and a visiting fellow at the German Marshall Fund. Senior fellow, visiting fellow, you're a busy guy. And I left out a lot of other things. He's also an analyst for Public Radio International. Is that on point? Yeah, which is a terrific show. He was a Beijing correspondent for Newsweek and lived in China for 7 years. And he says he's traveled extensively. I think you said you've hit every village, town, and
country ship. Yeah.
Sorry?
Country ship, is that a thing?
Yes.
I don't know.
So
these little different places. Yeah.
He's well traveled all through China. So let me turn it over to Isaac to introduce our distinguished panelists. Thank you.
Thank you, Bobby. So really good to be here. Glad we're having this conversation. Before I introduce four people who in this room certainly don't need to be introduced, I want to make a general point about where we are on this debate. A few weeks ago, the FT published an article that had said that two top Trump advisors had suggested banning all Chinese students from American universities. And I know I can speak for everyone in this panel and probably everyone in this room who realized immediately that was a absolutely horrific, unethical, disgusting idea and not at all what we're trying to do in having this conversation. So what we're trying to figure out is how do we deal with the Communist Party's influence on Chinese campuses, with the increased entanglement that American universities have financially and ethically with China, and how do we do that while still providing a really wonderful educational environment for American and Chinese students? So that's where we're coming from, and that's part of the conversation we're going to have today. So Perry Link on my far left, I think you might have been the first China person I ever heard of.
Am I always on your far left?
Too soon, Perry. We'll get there. And he has been doing this literally since before I was born, well, just by a few years, and has written many wonderful books. I think maybe the first thing that came to mind when I heard I was going to be on a panel with Perry is the idea of the Anaconda in the Chandelier, which is still by far the best metaphor for censorship from China, and that is not. So much of it is internal, so much of it is self-censorship, so much of it is individuals responding to this perceived beast above them. So thank Perry for that and a lot of the other great work that he's doing wherever he's sitting. And next we have Rochelle Peterson, who has done a really excellent report on Confucius Institutes in American universities and I think really helped to galvanize the debate about how we want to handle Chinese state money in American universities, what's a responsible way to do it, what are some requirements for transparency. We have Bethany Allen Ibrahimian, who is an ex-colleague of mine at Foreign Policy Magazine and got a nice mention in Pence's speech via some of the work that she's done on bringing to light some Chinese student organizations. And I think it was strange, maybe other people in the audience had this impression, but watching Pence's speech, I think a lot of people who normally don't agree with Pence on anything really felt a lot of common cause in the ways that he laid out some of the issues with China's relationship with America and some of the things that they were doing. And then Teng Biao, a Chinese human rights lawyer who is really one of the people in that space who I admire the most. And it's unfortunately difficult for a lot of Chinese human rights activists to come to the States and maintain both their relevance and their integrity, and Tongbiao has certainly done both. So very glad to have you all here. Perry, would love to start with you, and just as a way of introduction, how did you get into this space? How is this something that became interesting to you, and really what should we be looking at here?
How I got into this space raises the question of this space, and most people who know my history here know that I've been on a blacklist. I can't go to China for now 22 years, since 1996. And I have a few notes I can share with you on both the pros and the cons of being in that situation. But I don't want to do that first because I don't want to run out of time. I have another little list of suggestions for what we might do about these things. And I'm going to keep that second too, because I want to start with the 2 points that I really want to be sure get made, or probably they've been made, but I want to remake them. And that's the power of self-censorship in the academic world, which is much bigger and stronger and more pervasive than the physical censorship. Just a few days ago, Springer Nature Books announced that it's going to cancel the websites in China that refer to Tiananmen or Falun Gong or Taiwan independence or all these topics. And recently that happened with Cambridge University Press too, and there was a big squabble, and basically the academic world won, and Cambridge University Press backed down. But that's small, in my view, compared to the self-censorship problem. Do we China scholars self-censor? You bet we do. And how? People are afraid of losing their access, and that's complex. It's not just not getting a visa, which has been my problem, but even if you get a visa, if you're an anthropologist, can you go to the field? If you're a historian, can you get into certain archives? If you're a political scientist, can you get interviews with certain important people? All of that depends, or at least is perceived to depend, that's the key point, on whether or not, on what you say, on whether what you say, write and say is being approved. Just to give a few examples, although you've already heard a lot this morning, we don't talk about Taiwan independence. We talk about the Taiwan Wenti, or the cross-strait relations. We don't talk about the occupation of Tibet. We don't call the June 4th massacre a massacre. It's 六四事件or something like that. This morning we had the example of, I forgot which of our panelists asked us to raise our hand if we had heard about the U.S. Ship sailing in international waters through the Taiwan Straits, or did we hear that the U.S. government had decided to be provocative in doing this? And even I raised my hand the wrong way. We China scholars who talk about China get into an insulated lingo where we know what we're talking about. And I don't want to say my fellow China scholars are dense in any sense. We know it was a massacre, even though we don't use the word and so on. But our students and the public don't. That's where the big costs of this comes in. The language becomes so customary that it's natural, and it even seems wrong not to use it. One of the most irritating questions I get sometimes from fellow China scholars, because I'm on a blacklist, is to say, duh, didn't you know that this would happen to you if you talk and write that way? As if the problem were that I didn't know I was crossing a red line. I know it, but choose not to. Because it's so accepted that you do follow these forms. The other main point about it is that people don't want to admit it. On one hand, we use this language. On the other hand, we don't want to put out there that we do. Isaac wrote a piece in the New Republic recently mentioning, among others, our colleague David Shambaugh, who apparently said to a group of, who were they, younger would-be scholars or journalists, run away if anybody calls you up and asks about human rights or Taiwan independence or any of these things. And then, and Isaac's article wrote about this, David said, no, I never said anything like that. And it makes him look bad, but I want to say in an odd sense something on his behalf. Those two things that he did, number one, warn young scholars not to touch certain topics, and turn around and say, no, 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 I never said that. Both of those phenomena are very, very common. We do this, but we don't want to lay it on the table that we do it. So the second major point I want to make, and then I'll take a break and you can change the subject if you like, are that the costs of doing this are to the U.S. public. That's the most painful part of it to me. And I might add the Chinese public, because when an American sinologist comes along and uses a phrase that fits Beijing lingo, that gets quoted by Beijing in Beijing lingo back to the people in China and said, look, even the American experts are saying it this way. So there are big costs here. Just as an example of what I mean by costs to the public, I did a little experiment the other day. I Googled some words about Chinese democracy and Tiananmen and things like this. And you know, you've all used Google. When you use Google, often there pops up a list of a menu that says, people also ask about, and then you plunge in there and you get a short answer to a simple question. A simple question popped up, does China have democracy? And this is quoting from Google. Chinese have expressed skepticism toward Western-style democracy as incompatible with traditionalist Chinese culture. They hold that the government is legitimate not when people influence it, but when it represents their highest interest. The Beijing Xuanchuanbu couldn't have put it more tersely. Do the people in China vote? People also ask. Answer, elections in China are based on a hierarchical electoral system whereby local people's congresses are directly elected and all higher levels of people's congresses up to the National People's Congress, the national legislature, are indirectly elected by the People's Congress of the level immediate below. Now, any China scholar knows that that's hookah, that's not really the way. There aren't elections that mean anything, and that's all just formality. Why is Google telling the American public, the world public, this canned response? Is China a democracy or a dictatorship? People's democratic dictatorship is a phrase incorporated into the Constitution of the People's Republic of China by Mao Zedong, the then leader of the Communist Party of China. End of answer. Was the Great Leap Forward a failure? You all know the Great Leap Forward that had crackpot agricultural policies that induced the world's largest famine. 30 million people or more died. The main cause, here's the answer, the main cause that resulted in the failure of the Great Leap Forward was the lack of central planning by the Chinese government. Now, there's so many levels of idiocy in that answer that it would take too much time to unpack them. One final example about the famine. This one, why did the Great Chinese Famine happen? Answer, according to the government and the Chinese Communist Party, the Great Famine was caused by a string of natural disasters. Communist historiography refers to it not as the Great Famine, but as the 3 years of natural disasters. There are seeds of truth in this claim. End of answer. Now, I don't want to blame these idiotic answers on my fellow China scholars, but I think the culture within which we don't tell our students, we don't write our books, we don't talk to the news media in frank, honest terms, allows this space to develop and get filled with junk. Now, some of these answers, I don't know, this is speculation, may have been written by moles from Beijing who are trained to, or whose job it is to write these answers. If you study them, you'll see some of the English isn't all that great, but I can't prove that. But there are my two big points I want to make. Does self-censorship in the scholarly world exist? Not only does it exist, it's everywhere. It's by far the rule, not the exception. And secondly, there are costs. And ultimately, the costs are to the American public and the world public.
Thank you, Barry. That does a really great job of outlining some of the issues that we're going to get in throughout this panel. Tom Usher, turn to you next.
I taught law at the university based in Beijing, and I didn't practice self-censorship. And I discussed every sensitive topic with my students, and I also participated in a lot of political and human rights activities. And eventually, I was fired by my university. By the way, all Chinese universities are not independent universities. They are controlled by the Chinese government, which is controlled by the Chinese Communist Party. As a scholar and human rights lawyer, I also I was disbarred and kidnapped and disappeared and tortured. And then 4 years ago, I came to the United States, visiting Harvard and NYU and a few other universities. But the harassment didn't stop. For example, my wife and my daughter were prevented from leaving China when I arrived here. And my wife was fired by her company due to the pressure of Chinese government. And ABA refused to publish my book after it sent me an invitation to write my own experience in China dealing with human rights cases. And I signed that agreement. ABA said to me, quote, there is a concern that we run the risk of upsetting the Chinese government by publishing your book. And because we have ABA commissions working in China, there is a fear that we would put them and their work at risk, unquote. So it's a typical case of self-censorship. Ivy League University canceled a talk by me and Chen Guangcheng. The reason is that our talk was scheduled on the day that the university president just came back from China meeting Chinese President Xi Jinping. So besides the Confucius Institute, the CSSA, the Students and Scholars Association, there are also some other associations like 同乡会、校友会, the Hometown Association, Alumni Associations, the Federation of Overseas Chinese, like that. And how do these institutions, these people, influence American higher education? The first thing is propaganda and brainwashing. Chinese government is very good at pushing its narrative, like the China model, like Asian value, human rights with Chinese characteristics, but it can be very soft, very subtle, and seemingly attractive, like 人类命运共同体, a community of shared future, like that. It's really beautiful, but under that slogans, there are a lot of brainwashing stuff. And second one is prevent sensitive speakers from being invited and sensitive topics being discussed. And there are a series of banned topics like not only TTT, the Tiananmen, Tibet, and Taiwan, but also persecution of Falun Gong, organ harvest, Xinjiang, corruption of top leaders, torture, forced abortion, death penalty, rights lawyers, underground churches, dissidents, Liu Xiaobo. So the list is consistently changing and growing. For example, I think you're very familiar with these examples, like in 2008, Tel Aviv University closed the art exhibition on Falun Gong because of the Chinese government pressure. In 2009 and 2013, respectively, North Carolina State University and Sydney University canceled the speech of Dalai Lama. And the third one is monitor Chinese governments and Chinese students and scholars. So if a Chinese student in the United States and in other countries is involved in political dissenting activities or does a research on the taboo subjects, he or she would be highly likely reported to the Chinese embassy, consulate, and he or she will have trouble as to going back to China or getting promotions, grants, or looking for a job in China. And the fourth one is like involvement in espionage. So the repressive Chinese government is weaponizing Chinese students, overseas Chinese students, to curb academic freedom on the Western campus. And the consequence, if you don't obey the rule, this rule or unwritten rules by the Chinese government, there are some negative consequences like a visa denial, Paralink, Andrew Nathan, and many others. They were banned from entering China, and that can be very, very harmful. Then we can see, Paralink can be also can be a leading scholar on China study, but the young scholars and many other students, they will be harmed very much. Their access to materials, their field work. And I have a friend who is in the United States now. He has very good potential to be a professor. He taught in #1 university, Peking University in China. But eventually he gave up his plan to get a PhD and to teach here because he's a dissident. He can't go back to China. So even if he gets a PhD, and even if he has potential, he published some books, it's very difficult for him to get a job in the American university because he can't bring American students to China. He can't get money, get Chinese money from here, and he will not be helpful in connecting that university to any Chinese institutions, and it's even worse. Like Professor Brady, after she published a very prominent report, her office and her home were broken in, and her working laptop was taken away. Last two examples, maybe. The University of Calgary in Canada. So after they gave His Holiness Dalai Lama an honorary degree in 2009, the Chinese government removed the university from its list of accredited universities. And then this UCSD, University of California, San Diego, after they invited Dalai Lama to give a speech, I think Chinese government decided that all government-funded scholars and students would not be allowed to study at that university. So I look forward to further discussions.
Thank you for that. I think those remarks complement really nicely with what Perry is saying, the way you explained the situation both in China and a lot of really relevant examples in the States. I'd like to add another phenomena that goes with this. So last year, scholars did a study of hundreds of millions of posts that Chinese trolls wrote. And they found that when an event happened in Beijing that the party was trying to distract attention from, the trolls wouldn't engage in arguments. Rather, they would just pump out positive information. So yeah, lovely things about the party, really like this new bridge, really like what Xi Jinping has been doing. Platitudes like this, and I think a lot of censorship that we get in the States is actually positive censorship, just this outpouring of information that sticks in our heads like advertising jingles, so that when we talk about the party, when we talk about China, we use phrases that we shouldn't necessarily use, but we're just in this environment. lifting hundreds of millions of people out of poverty is an example. Whenever you have someone defend Beijing, defend the party, that's a phrase they say. I say that phrase myself. People say, oh yeah, good things the party have done. They've lifted hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. You can argue that may be true, but we don't need to speak about China like the Communist Party speaks about China. We can come up with our own language that reflects our realities and our opinions. And I think one of the things we're trying to do in having this and similar conversations is to find a way to teach students to think for themselves about China. So on that, I'd love to turn to Bethany, who's done a lot of the really seminal reporting on the party in American universities, and just love to give everyone some groundwork on that.
Sure. So I want to start out with something that Francis Fukuyama said in the early 90s. Of course, the early 90s, after the fall of the Berlin Wall and the collapse of the Soviet Union, as we all know, there was this sort of upswell of really positive, optimistic feelings about the future of the world. Democracy has won, authoritarianism has failed, everything's getting better and better and better, life is great. And so Francis Fukuyama wrote in one of his pieces in the early 90s that there are 30,000 or 20 to 30,000 Chinese students studying in America. They're being exposed to these wonderful ideas of democracy. They're going to bring it back with them to China, and it's going to change China, and it's so wonderful and so exciting. It's just so interesting to me that we looked at that and didn't realize that if we were thinking that, then the Chinese Communist Party was thinking that too, and they were about 10 steps ahead of us. So after 1989, after the Tiananmen massacre, there was a great a flow of Chinese students and other people out of China around the world to universities, to various diaspora communities, and the Chinese government, the Chinese Communist Party, was very afraid that there would be a repeat Sun Yat-sen. So in the late Qing dynasty, there were numerous Chinese diaspora communities around the world because they were exiles. They couldn't operate inside of China, and in those communities, a lot of that is where the Republican movement, the democratic movement, flourished, and where those networks were built. And eventually, they were able to successfully bring those networks and those ideas back to China, overthrow the Qing dynasty, and establish the Republic of China. Again, if we know that, the Chinese Communist Party knows that. And so after 1989, they made a huge effort to go out, to extend their control and their Leninism and their authoritarianism into Chinese diaspora communities, including Chinese students. And they've done this in a variety of ways. Anne-Marie Brady has done wonderful work about the United Front and how that really was rebuilt and sent out beginning in the 1990s. It also happened to Chinese students in American universities and in basically any university around the world, particularly in democratic countries, but everywhere. So how does that work? How does the Chinese Communist Party establish a kind of control or a kind of monitoring and a kind of, let's use the word guidance, over Chinese students studying in the United States? They do it in a variety of ways. One of the ways that they do it is through the establishment of the Chinese Students and Scholars Association, CSSAs. So those first started appearing in the U.S. I think in the 1980s was the earliest example I could find of one. There's not an official single website for CSSAs, but they are all clearly loosely related. There's between 100 and 150 in the United States. There's many, many more than that around the world. And basically any university in the United States that has a significant number of Chinese students is going to have a CSSA. So I'm going to describe shortly and briefly how that specific function of control and guidance works, and it's directed through the Chinese consulates and embassies. But I think what we have not realized in the United States, and I hope that we're getting better at this, is that for many Chinese students, and I absolutely do not want to speak for all of them or for any of them, but from what I have been told, actually the environment that they're in many times when it comes to experiencing democracy, experiencing free speech, and experiencing freedom of assembly in the United States, particularly surrounding issues related to China, that does not really exist for them very much, especially now. So we have assumed that they're here, that they're experiencing, the fresh air of democracy, when in fact, the Chinese Communist Party's entire goal has been to inoculate them against that and to prevent them from fully experiencing that if they want to talk freely and organize freely about their home country. So how does this work? There's 100 to 150 CSSAs on campuses across the United States. In many circumstances, these are the largest and most well-organized and most well-funded student groups on campus, particularly at universities that have a very large Chinese student population. So this is how it works. Every Chinese embassy and consulate in the US has an education section, education consular section. There are anywhere from 2 to 4 or more educational consular officials. And so each embassy or consulate has a region. This is for visas for anything. They have, these states or these regions belong to us. This is, where we do our work. And the education officials will locate, and get into contact with all of the CSSAs in that region, and they will divide them by education and consular officer. So every education consular officer here in the US has a certain number of CSSAs that they are responsible for. So they create a WeChat group with the names of the current president of each CSSA. So they can, at the touch of a few strokes of their key on their smartphone, they can send a message instantly to all the CSSA presidents of all those CSSAs immediately. And so that's how they stay in close contact. Now, to understand how the kind of guidance works, it's subtle. It's not, it's not like they're not constantly sending political threats, but it's very much a give and take. We'll be helpful to you. We're here to help you, and they are. We'll help you with if you are having visa troubles, if you get sick, if there's safety issues, we will help you. We'll give so much. And we've given you so much. We're just asking you to do this one little political thing for us. Can you just please do that? So this is how there's they establish a relationship with all of these presidents. So in the past 2 years, there have been more and more political asks from the consulates. So for example, well, this has always happened. When there's a visiting Chinese leader, so for example, Xi Jinping or Hu Jintao, when they come visit the U.S., the consulates will organize CSSAs and they will pay individual students cash and organize vans and snacks and posters and stuff for them to come in and demonstrate in support of the visiting leader. And they're secretive about their role. So the Chinese government is secretive about its role in organizing these demonstrations. Why do they organize them? And why are they secretive about their role in it? Because it's about controlling a narrative, both in the American public and among Chinese students and among Chinese people back in the US. So if you see, hundreds or even thousands of Chinese students who have come out and look how much they love the Chinese Communist Party, they're really supportive of Xi Jinping. For the American public, they see that and they think, I thought these students would come here and fall in love with democracy. Why do so many of them, every time we see in the news, we see groups of Chinese students, they're always organizing to be, to support the party. Maybe we were wrong. Maybe we got it wrong. Maybe there is something about the Chinese Communist Party. Maybe there is something about this one-party rule that really appeals to people, because we're Americans, we're very understanding. We want to understand this, and so we think, maybe democracy really isn't just for them. That is what they want. That's one of the reasons they do this, and that's how they kind of control the narrative in which we exist. That kind of demonstration also demonstrates to every single Chinese student in the United States and people back home that the Communist Party is here too. They can do this. They can organize these students. They see you. They're in touch with the people who lead you. You can have your own personal thoughts and opinions, but you can't organize around it. You can only organize under our auspices. So in that way, it's similar, in fact, to what you have back in China. I can keep going, but I have so many more examples of this. I'll give just a couple other different kinds of examples that don't have to do with Chinese students. There is, regarding self-censorship, There is a more extreme form of that. So I know of a case of a well-known China studies professor who was put on a visa blacklist. He's an American. And in order to get off the blacklist, he agreed to pass on information about his students to a Chinese intelligence officer, and he got his visa back. So that happened. If it happened once, has it happened more than once? Maybe. So these are the kinds of things that are actually happening behind the scenes when we see, a public narrative that seems, to not talk about Tibet as much. Oh, I wonder how that happened. It must be that Tibet's not very important. Or when we see a narrative, that is, well, the Chinese economy is just doing so well, that really matters more than anything. Where does that come from? And why is that such a common narrative? It's because to speak up otherwise, there is such a strong current against you.
There's so many,
yeah, I'll stop.
Many wonderful
I'll stop.
There. I've definitely never heard that one. And I think you bring up a lot of really good points, but also, for the people in the room who aren't journalists, it's really important to know that so much of this is the tip of the iceberg, and to get examples like the one Bethany cited and Tom Biao have cited are very, very difficult to actually get and to prove. So there does seem to be a whole lot more that's going on that we just don't know about. So to talk about a specific example of party influence in America, Rochelle, would love to hear about Confucius Institutes and also what you have learned since that wonderful report you put out.
Sure, well, thank you. I'm with the National Association of Scholars, a membership organization of professors and scholars across the country. And several years ago, some of our members came to us and said, there's talk about establishing a Confucius Institute on our campus. I've heard some suspicious things about Confucius Institutes. What do you know about them? We decided to look into them and found that there are more than 100 across the United States on American college campuses. Right now, there are 107 Confucius Institutes in the US. 2 of those are in the process of closing down, which is good news, but 107 currently, as well as about 500 Confucius classrooms at K-12 schools in the US. What are Confucius Institutes and classrooms? Basically, they are Chinese government-sponsored centers on campuses. They offer classes in Chinese language and culture. The Chinese government selects teachers that it proposes to the university. The university typically can select from a slate of candidates that is put forward by the Chinese government. This is being run through an agency called the Hanban, which is part of the Chinese Ministry of Education. In addition to sending over the teachers, the Hanban offers 3,000 textbooks per year to Confucius Institutes to be used in these classes. And then the institute itself is governed by an American director and a Chinese director who have co-equal authority. The American director is usually a professor at the university, sometimes an administrator. And this is key, often someone who will vote on the tenure decisions of younger professors. So these institutes offer classes, sometimes open to the public, sometimes just to the university. I did case studies at 12 Confucius Institutes, and 30% of the classes in Chinese language and culture at my case study, or 30% of the Confucius Institute classes at the case studies that I did were being offered for credit. So students could get credit for these classes, in some cases even fulfill their core distribution requirements by taking classes at an institute sponsored by the Chinese government, being taught by a teacher selected by the Chinese government using textbooks that were selected by the Chinese government. This is problematic on many different fronts. One is simply the university should have control over all these things, over who is teaching, over what the textbooks are. Another is the external effects of having a Confucius Institute. One of those external effects is that there's a lot of censorship, self-censorship, in some cases propaganda, and there's also a lot of pressure on professors outside the institute to self-censor. Of course, there's already that pressure, as Dr. Link has shared, but the Confucius Institute adds another layer to that. So when I went around to college and university campuses and met with professors who technically were totally distinct from the Confucius Institute, had nothing to do with it, but they taught Chinese language or history for the university, not for the institute, they felt many of the same pressures that the Confucius Institute teachers felt to watch what they said. Most wanted to be interviewed only anonymously because They said they felt concerns that the Confucius Institute was watching them. They felt pressure that if students came to them and said, "What is the Confucius Institute? Should I take classes there?" They felt pressure that they should say, "Yes, of course, it's just like any other part of the university." They felt pressure that they could not express their concerns about the Confucius Institute to anyone in the university administration because the institute brought in significant funding, not just the free teachers and textbooks, but there's actually about $100,000 on average per year that the Hanban sends to each university to support the institute. And one person that I interviewed actually, he forbade us from meeting in his office or even in the building where he worked. We had to meet in the basement of another building on the outskirts of campus just to be sure that no one saw that he was talking with me about the Confucius Institute. A common concern that I heard was the Confucius Institute director is a senior professor at my university. He will vote on tenure and promotion decisions. I can't come out against the Confucius Institute or even express concerns about it. In addition to these concerns that the professors have, there were also a lot of concerns voiced to me about the kinds of pressures that students face, especially Chinese students studying in the US who now have this Chinese government-sponsored entity right on their campus, listening to what they say and all of the pressures that are associated with that. So there are 107 Confucius Institutes in the US. In the last year or two, there's been a lot more focus and attention given to these institutes. Just in the last year, 5 of them have announced that they are closing, which I think is really good news. But more remains to be done, and I'll save discussions of potential solutions for the end.
Thank you, Rochelle. So in 2005, roughly a decade after Francis Fukuyama wrote the words that Bethany cited, Deputy Secretary of State Robert Zoellick gave a crucial speech about US-China relations titled "Whither China?" And in it, he asked, how do we, now that China has entered the WTO and is part of the global trading system, how do we make China a responsible stakeholder in the system? And where we are today is we have, I think to a large degree, lost the illusion that America has a great power and ability to shape China and to shape the role that China plays in an international system. And I think now the question is much more, whither America? How are we going to respond to Beijing's interactions in America and in American universities? So I'd start with you, Rochelle. I'd love to hear, I think we all agree that it's really important for American universities to teach students about China and to teach the Chinese language. And ideally, instead of Beijing funding Chinese language studies, the US government or private US institutions would fund it. But they're not doing enough of that, which is why some universities go for a Confucius Institute. So what do you think we should do to meet this need that's clearly there without compromising values by taking money from places we shouldn't?
Well, we should use the bully pulpit and call out colleges and universities when they have sold their academic integrity to an authoritarian foreign government and come out on record and express concerns about Confucius Institutes. I mentioned that 5 have closed in the last year. 4 of those came after a member of Congress in their state wrote to them expressing concerns about the institute, 2 in Texas and 2 in Florida. That has proven very effective. More members of Congress should send letters to the universities in their states expressing concerns about their Confucius Institutes. We also need more in the way of transparency. The American public should know when foreign governments are pouring money into American colleges and universities. There are a lot of loopholes in the area of the Higher Education Act that governs disclosure of foreign gifts to colleges and universities. So more needs to be done for that. In terms of actually funding Chinese language programs, I'm going to be controversial here. I don't think that the US government should pour additional money into this. The reason I say that is colleges and universities have the funding that they need if they want to teach Chinese language and culture. They have the funding that they need if they want to teach almost any area of the humanities. If you look at college and university budgets, and what has happened in the last 2 decades is that the university administrations have been growing exponentially as opposed to the size of the faculties. In fact, some studies put it that over the course of the last 15 years, the the university administrations have grown 50% larger than the corresponding growth in the faculty. So what has happened is the increasing corporatization of higher education, in which they are increasingly fundraising mechanisms that are aimed at raising money for the bureaucracy within their own universities. And simultaneously, we've seen with that a decline in the power of the faculty in governing the university, as well as a decline in the ability of the faculty to teach. So, and one more anecdote on this. The New York Fed calculated that increasing financial aid for students, actually 65% of that money gets captured by the university in the form of just raising tuition. So that said, I think if we're going to talk about giving further money to higher education in order to try to buy them out of Confucius Institutes, we need to think very closely and carefully about how that should be done in a manner that doesn't just go into university administrations, but actually affects teaching and classroom experience and the kinds of educational experiences that college is supposed to be about.
Does anyone want to respond to anything Michelle said? So I'd also love to hear, Perry, how do we, what's the magic bullet for solving self-censorship among American academia?
Magic bullet, let's see, I know I put it somewhere here.
I thought you were going to bring it.
Several people this morning and this afternoon have mentioned transparency and consciousness raising. I think that's right. And in passing, I want to salute the Hudson Institute and Freedom House for running this program. We need more of this, and the cameras in the back recording it. I don't think it's quite fair, though, to put on the students and the public the responsibility of handling the misguidance that they might be getting. I think we teachers and administrators have to do that. And I'll address that in a couple of layers. For faculty, I think for censorship, for faculty, it would be wonderful if all faculty were reminded of the tenure system. Now, they don't need reminding of the tenure system. Faculty love the tenure system because when you get tenure, you have guaranteed employment, unless you do some kind of really egregious sexual misbehaviors. I mean, you get guaranteed employment until you retire, and you get a good pension, so you really get upper middle class lifestyle all the way to the grave, and you get a honored position in society, and that's a great deal. I keep telling my grad students, you want to be a professor, go for it. You think your thoughts, you write your thoughts down, and you get paid for it right till the end. But why is it there? It's not there because we all think professors are nice people and we want to buy their groceries for them. It's there because the deal is, if you get this good deal, your part of the bargain is to tell the truth as you see it, without fear or favor. That's the rationale for the tenure system. So I must say it galls me when some of my colleagues, the tenured ones, will say, oh, don't say that, don't write that, don't study that topic because it'll hurt your career. Dude, your responsibility is to the public who's given you this great deal. This morning, Josh said that the corporations will respond and bow to China sometimes because they are beholden to their stakeholders. I think we scholars have to recognize we owe society the duty to tell the truth as we see it. And I think if we ballyhooed that idea, it might spread, because professors on the whole are honest people and sincere people, and we can do that. For administrators, for example, of the Confucius classrooms, I've often made the argument that if you're going to bring in a Confucius Institute and you want to make sure that academic freedom is preserved, the thing to do is very early on put out stakes around the borderlines of the sensitive area. We're going to have a lecture on Liu Xiaobo, who died in prison. We're going to have a lecture on, or a seminar on Taiwan independence, or on Tibet, or all these other topics that Teng Biao just raised that are banned. Why? In order to stick our finger in the eye of somebody? No, but just to put out the borderlines so that it's clear that anything within those borderlines, meaning anything, is doable. I'm almost going to do this. I'm visiting at the University of Heidelberg this year, and they have a Confucius Institute. And they were introduced the other day. It was a big opening ceremony for China Studies, and here's this project and this office and the Confucius Institute. And you're right, it was introduced just as if it's a normal part of the university, even though, to my eye, it's like an advertisement in the Washington Post, right? You can see this is an advertisement, not the real thing. But I don't think the students could see it that way. So I don't know if I'll have nerve to do this, but what I might do is when spring comes, go ask the professors, the Heidelberg professors who are working with the Institute, shouldn't we have a commemoration of the 30th anniversary of the Beijing massacre? I mean, whatever your view is, you can't deny that is a major important event in modern Chinese history. Let's do it. Let's talk. Bring a government person. He or she can talk. Let's try. Do I dare? Do you think I should try that? For the government's role and whether or not funding, I mean, I love your contrarianism and saying universities have enough money so they should make these decisions. And you're quite right that universities in the last three decades have turned much too much toward funding administration instead of faculty and students. But I would still say that for universities that have Confucius Institutes, the federal government might well communicate transparently what some of these problems are. And you're taking money from the Chinese government, okay, you don't need as much from us. And vice versa for you people who don't have a Confucius Institute or who had one and then decided to cancel it, we'll give you a little more. You're on the right track. So I think the government does have that role too.
Please.
I wanted to, I think the point that you made about universities drawing those lines is a great point. And I wanted to mention the Xinjiang Initiative, which is very specifically that, but in a sense of solidarity. So there, China is running concentration camps in Xinjiang where it has put Muslim minorities at maybe up to 1 million or more. This is an egregious human rights violation, that basically the United Nations was founded to stop, and it's not stopping it. And the Xinjiang Initiative is, was it Kevin Carrico? No, who started?
I think he was involved.
Kevin Carrico. Okay, great. They said, in order to, first of all, just to make sure that people know about it, and second of all, to protect everyone so that there does not need to be a need for self-censorship, to prevent self-censorship, and to express solidarity to make it sort of safe to talk about it. We're gonna, you can sign a thing promising that you will bring up the Xinjiang camps in every, public talk that you give, and that is a wonderful way that a university or a professor can draw that line, and say, look, we're going to talk about this, and we're going to talk about it with everyone. And I think that is a really good potential solution for some self-censorship issues. If every university agreed to host the Dalai Lama, China would stop cutting off its scholars from going to universities that host the Dalai Lama. So that's a great initiative in my opinion.
I think that's a great point. I think that you hit two things with that. One was very relevant to what we're talking about, and also you managed to bring up Xinjiang in this panel, which I think no one in this room probably needs a reminder of, but it is wonderful to see China scholars of all stripes and journalists and activists, really anytime the situation of China comes up, to mention very clearly, yes, there's probably roughly, I think we can even say there is roughly a million Muslims in concentration camps in northwest China, and we don't have a good solution for that. But really just bringing it up, just talking about it, is something that we should all be doing basically every chance we get. So I applaud you for bringing that up now and also tying it into what we're talking about. Please.
So I want to talk about something that we haven't mentioned today. Since we are talking about China's threat to global academic freedom, NYU, Duke University, and some other universities have a campus in China, like Liverpool University and Nottingham University. So and some professors teaching there argued that they can enjoy academic freedom in China, even though there is no academic freedom in other part of China. They said they can teach, they can discuss everything with their students, but it is not true. I think it's a self-deception to claim that the campus in China can enjoy academic freedom, even though the teachers, the professors can raise these sensitive topics like Falun Gong or Tiananmen and Tibet, Xinjiang. The students, the Chinese, especially the Chinese students, are not able to freely join the conversation. So it's a common sense in China that Chinese students will not talk about Falun Gong or Tiananmen in the classroom. Recently, some Chinese scholars, dissident scholars, they have an idea. They want to write to universities which host the Confucius Institute that we want give a talk at Confucius Institute. If you accept that's good. We talk about human rights lawyers Liu Xiaobo and Falun Gong. And if you don't, then it shows that you are not illegitimate. You are not legitimate. You are self-censor. So I think it's also the same thing with the foreign campers in China. If they publicly talk about the Xinjiang concentration camps, Falun Gong, the roundup of human rights lawyers, then it can be kind of justification of that campus at the NYU Shanghai or Duke Nanjing University. Of course, the Confucius Institute is really problematic, but we can give them pressure to, if they can publicly criticize Chinese government, talk about human rights, that's good.
Really important points. Before we open it up for questions, I'd like to ask each panelist to briefly respond to how do we counter pernicious Chinese influence or Beijing's influence at American universities without descending to a Red Scare, without making this an uncomfortable environment for Chinese students?
I'll start with that. I'd like to mention a point that Samantha Hoffman and Peter Mattis made in an article they wrote for The Hill back several months ago. And they made the point that in responding to Chinese Communist Party influence or interference or coercion in the United States, particularly among Chinese diaspora communities and students, we should approach it with an attitude of restoring civil rights to them that have been taken away. They should be able to start to form clubs and to have organizations that promote Taiwan independence, that promote democracy inside of China, that are able to freely criticize the Chinese government and the Chinese Communist Party. They should be able to host and without fear, they should be able to host events on their universities in which they're able to freely debate any aspect of Chinese society, politics, and government. And they are not currently able to do that in many cases. So to counteract that aspect, and this is true also outside of universities. So in Chinese diaspora communities, it's very, very difficult to have an organization, sort of your own indigenous, organization of any kind, without it coming under pressure from the consulates or from proxies of the Chinese government to maintain the party line. So their civil rights have been taken away from them, their rights to speech and to freedom. And the most important thing that we can do is restore those to them. Say, you are here, you are American, this is your right, and we will support you. And one way to do that is simply, as this has been a theme, bring this to light. American society should know that there are Americans here who don't have those rights, or they face a lot of risk or coercion if they try to exercise them. And the fear, and this is what Peter Mattis and Samantha Hoffman mentioned, is that this should not primarily be an issue of national security. This is not a law enforcement approach. This is a civil rights approach. And that is a really important attitude to keep in mind because Chinese diaspora communities and Chinese Americans are the target of a lot of authoritarian pressure. They should not also be the target of racist or Red Scare pressure coming from a democratic government as well, their own democratic government.
I'll pick up on that. I think with regards to higher education, the answer is we talk about intellectual freedom. Higher education is the special institution that is set up for the purpose of intellectual freedom, where you pursue the truth wherever it leads, where you keep an open mind, where you debate freely. Confucius Institutes and some of the other forms of Chinese government influence on higher education that we've been talking about are aimed at countering intellectual freedom and countering freedom of speech, either from the Chinese students who are feeling like they are under surveillance, or from scholars, or from anyone who's part of the university campus. We need to protect intellectual freedom, support intellectual freedom, and that is one of the big reasons why Confucius Institutes are a problem, is because they run counter to intellectual freedom.
I agree with my two co-panelists entirely on that point, and recently ran across a concrete example of it. I'm on a committee at the University of California to study policy about these things, and one of the problems we're trying to make a policy about is, what do you do when students are afraid, Chinese students, are afraid to say what they think in class because they don't know if somebody else is going to report it to the consulate. And what we're going to try to do is to tell all the Chinese students when they come in with a clear, strong policy statement about academic freedom, and try to make it seem to them that we're here to support you. We're not here to attack anybody because they're Chinese. We're here to support you. Because the majority of them are not ones. They're going to go rat at the consulate. So if you can put it that way, it helps. Now, to be sure, the other side, the consulate side, will try to use this nationalist label in order to discredit any attempt to help the students. I, for example, when I'm scolded in the Chinese media, I'm called Fanhua, anti-China. And my whole life has been about China. My wife's China. My children are half Chinese. And yet I'm labeled anti-China. So that, in essence, is the key point we have to try to make, that we are anti-communist, we're not anti-China.
So I think recently Australia passed some legislation on foreign influence. So I think we need both legal aspect and non-legal aspect. Like theft of intellectual property, cyber attacks, physical attacks. These are illegal, but most of the Chinese influencing operations and platforms are not really legal, not related to law. I give you an example. It's very subtle. That my case goes. Go to weekend Chinese school, and suppose it has nothing to do with Chinese government or Confucius Institute, and some Americans children are also studying Chinese there, but the teachers there kind of brainwashed. It's very likely if they were born and educated in China. So they talk about Mao Zedong. They talk about Xinjiang, Tibet, or Lei Feng. So so these teachers, unintentionally maybe, are brainwashing the Americans' younger generation. So it has nothing to do with legislation, and what we should do is to raise the awareness of this issue, another point I want to make is we should be very careful about the increasing anti-China narrative. All these issues we raised today are serious. We take all these things seriously, but we should not go too far to be anti-Chinese people. Like reportedly, President Trump said in the event that almost every student from China that comes over to this country is a spy. So we can't be that racist, xenophobic. We should also make point that many Chinese students, of course, many Chinese students, scholars, and Chinese people, they do very bad things, endangering liberal democracy here. But many of Chinese people here are also victims. They are being monitored. They given pressure, and they fear of their family members, their relatives in China. So they are also victim. And what we are against is the policy of the Chinese Communist Party, not Chinese people.
That's great points. So we're going to open it up for questions right now. A brief reminder that a question is a short statement followed by a question mark, and apologies in advance if I cut you off for not following that. So we'll start over here.
Louisa Grieva with the Uyghur Human Rights Project. Thank you for some great presentations. Perry, for those students who are reporting on the others, isn't it protecting their civil rights not to be pressured by the consulate through threats that you will have something wrong on your social credit score, or don't you want to take care for your family? The Uyghurs who are all being told you need to report on what's going on in the Uyghur exile community, don't you want to protect your family?
Thank you, Lisa. Do you want to respond to that?
No, the answer is yes.
Yeah.
End of answer. You're right.
All right.
All of them are victims, right? At one level or another, victims, and we need to approach it that way.
Next question.
Thank you for taking my question. My name's Bob Lean. I'm an independent researcher. Isn't removing the Confucius Institutes from institutes of higher education fall under the same type of idea of keeping safe spaces on universities so we don't have harmful ideas being projected to the students? Isn't that a problem when you start approaching removing educational institutions from an educational institution?
Thank you. And Bob, I'd like to add to that great question. What to do when Chinese students adapt the language of safe spaces and political correctness to say that they shouldn't be forced to hear things about the Dalai Lama or about Falun Gong because it's triggering to them or politically incorrect?
Well, I think the answer is that Confucius Institutes are cutting against freedom of speech and intellectual freedom. So it's not just that they're putting forward pro-China views and that to remove Confucius Institutes would be eliminating that stream of thought, because it wouldn't. There would be other sources of pro-China views on campus, but that they're actually working to suppress other forms of speech that are more critical of the Chinese regime or critical just of the Confucius Institute. So to call on universities to remove the Confucius Institute is a way of protecting intellectual freedom, but also simply a way of protecting their academic integrity. And here I want to clarify, one of the earlier panels was talking about how are Confucius Institutes different from the Alliance Française and the Goethe Institute, and one of the answers was the government behind it is different. Well, there's also another really big difference, which is that Confucius Institutes are on college campuses, giving a foreign government access to prestige and credibility. These other centers sponsored by other governments are off campus. They are not offering classes for credit. They're not being presented to the public as the source of academic discourse that has gone through peer review, spoken by professors who have PhDs and so on. So no, I don't think it is inappropriate to ask universities to give up their Confucius Institutes.
Thank you. I'm Terry Thompson. I teach graduate cyber courses at the University of Maryland, Baltimore County, and the Johns Hopkins University. Isaac, you mentioned at the beginning a politician who said we should just cancel all Chinese scholarships and send the students home. We have a history in America going back 150 years of teaching Chinese students for a lot of different reasons, and we've generally thought most of those reasons were positive. So my question is what we're seeing now with the threats that we've been talking about on this panel and earlier today, is this a turning of the historical wheel that now we're looking at the negative side as opposed to what has been looked at as the positive side before? Or is the system so corrupt and the tentacles of the CCP so strong that we should just cancel the whole thing and actually do what the politicians say and send the students home?
Let's take 2 more questions, and then we'll bring that one to the panel.
Thank you. My name is Qiao Mu, self-exiled professor from China. I have a question for the Professor Perry Link, whom I admire for a long time. We have an email exchange the first time meet here. My question is, since you have working teaching university for many years, you may meet many different generations of Chinese scholar students here. Did you find any differences of attitude and values of a different generation of Chinese students? Like for this generation, they were born in 1960s or 70s. They came here, they think everything here is better than China, except food. They want to learn from America, not only for technology, but the politics, system, everything. They have self-censorship even now, but they do not cause trouble for them or for their relatives. But different from the young generation, like those born in 1980s and 1990s, they're not they're not self-censorship, but self-consciousness. They think China is good, everything is good. They got high-speed train, they got the internet service.
Talasha, can you give the microphone to Jonas? I think so your question is about how the 60s and the 80s, the different generation of Chinese students and how they're viewing things. Is that the question?
Yeah, so my question is that those young generation, it seems they are not only self-censorship, but self-consciousness. They think China is good, is grow up very fastly, so sooner or later will pass the American. So you cannot say they are self-censorship, but maybe it's hard.
Okay, thank you. Pass the microphone to Jonas. Thank you.
Thanks, Jonas Plesner, extraordinary panel. My question is to Cheng Biao. Was basically your life is an example of what we're discussing. So I was going to ask you what could be done more to protect you. You're in the U.S. now. You're a resident, and you mentioned also in your Washington Post article that China's sort of long arm over here. So what sort of kind of measurements, if any, could an open society take more to protect somebody like you?
Great. So we have 3 questions. We have for Teng Biao, what we can do to protect people like you. We have a question of, is the whole system rotten and should we take more drastic measures? And then the questions of how students have evolved and different perceptions of China. So Teng Biao, would you like to start?
I appreciate that many American foundations and institutes support me. They give me funding and support my research. They invite me to give talks. That's good. But I think it's very difficult to protect all dissidents, scholars in foreign countries like me. I have given some examples that my wife, my kids, my family members in back in China, so they can be threatened by Chinese government. So there are some related legislations like Magnitsky Act, and there are some new policies, and we are all seeing a policy shift toward China. So that's also one of my focus, that we should examine the human rights policy toward China. We should rethink about the so-called engagement policy actually many Western democracies adopt a policy of appeasement, and it's high time to change that.
Thank you. And Perry, if you want to address both of those questions.
About students, I think when Isaac introduced that question of send all the Chinese students home, he said that he thinks everybody on the panel agrees with him. I certainly do. I don't think it's a serious question to consider that we should cut off visas for all Chinese students. That would be ridiculous. I don't know if there's more to your question than that, though, but my answer to it is that it's not rotten. No, we should still have Chinese students come. For this other question of different generations, yes, I do notice a difference. Now, I haven't studied this question sociologically, so I can only give you impressions of students that I've taught and seen. But in the 80s, from the late 70s on, it was a kind of a 逃命心理. I have to get out of China and establish a beachhead in the West. No idea of wanting to go back. It was really fleeing and then trying to get rooted. And after Tiananmen, there was more of that. But over the next 2 decades, yes, what you described is very visible. The students that come to UC Riverside now, the undergrads, on the whole are from wealthy backgrounds. My impression is that they didn't get into good universities through the Gaokao in China. So their parents have money and they pay for them to come. Unfortunately, our administrators love this because they pay full tuition. And I think accept students who really aren't ready to come to college. Some because they don't know English well, and some because, frankly, they're just not college material. I hate to put it that bluntly. But it's hard to generalize, though. This last quarter, I taught a course in contemporary Chinese literature in Chinese, and I had about 20 students, 7 of whom were from the mainland. One of them was great. He's from Mongolia, spoke beautiful Mandarin, did the work, wrote well, thought well, independent, 独立思考，没问题. 2 or 3 others were sort of okay, and the others were complete deadwood. They just sat and didn't do anything. If I asked them questions, they couldn't respond. They only cared about their grade and wanted to get a degree. So it's a mixed bag, but on the whole, yeah, the students aren't as good as they were 3 decades ago, the ones from China. I'm talking about undergrads. Grads are a different topic. They go into different fields, and some of them are very, very good. That's different.
So we'll start there. It's closer, these two, and then we'll come over to this side.
Jennifer Zheng from the Epoch Times. Actually, this question only came to my mind after I listened to the panel discussions for the whole day. So maybe my question should address to all panels instead of this one. So my question is, judging from what the CCP has doing to its own people, like starving 30 to 40 millions of Chinese people to death, and then during the Cultural Revolution killed maybe another 7 million, and in recent years, 10 plus years, killed maybe another millions for the organs on demand, like a prisoner of conscience like Falun Gong, Uyghur, and Tibetans. So the nature of these things is no less evil or nothing different from what the former Nazi Germany or former Soviet Union or current North Korea is doing. So my question is, what prevents the West or the free world from seeing and treating the Communist Party like we treated Nazi Germany, Soviet Union, and currently North Korea? Thank you.
And then question back there.
Thank you, each of you. My name is Farkat Jawdat. I'm an Uyghur, and then I'm also a U.S. citizen. I work for the U.S. government as a contractor, software engineer. So my life is totally destroyed since February 6, 2018. That day, my mom left me a last message, which saying that she was going to the re-education camp. So it's been more than 8 months, 20 plus days since I heard her voice for the last message. So I was at Indiana University last Friday and Saturday. We had a panel discussion about what's happening in Xinjiang to the Uyghur people and how it's affecting not only the people in the region, but also the people around the globe, or especially in the US. It was really good, and then we learned a lot from that conversation as well, because the whole humanity faced that kind of situation 70 plus years ago, but today we are facing totally brand new stuff. So we are we are lost our vision in these dark moments. We don't know what to do sometimes. So it's really good to have a conversation on the university level to the people, so let them know that it's really happening. And even though it's happening more than 6,000 miles away on the outside of the globe, but it's really affecting the people around them as well, like regular American citizens. So my question is it hard for the US government or for the US people to work together to close those institutes, or is it hard for us to use those institutes to talk to Chinese people, talk to the university, college professors or people to make them understand what we are going through, or what have the Chinese government done to the other people as well? And the second thing is, last weekend, the first Friday was about what's happening right now, and then we made all the people cry. But on the Saturday, we had a Uyghur cultural night where we showed all the people how colorful our culture is: food, clothing, language, dancing, songs, everything. And then by doing that, I believe we showed to other people who never heard about Uyghur people that we are not a nation that just popped up recently on the news because we have millions of people are locked up in those jails or concentration camps, but we are the nation with colorful identity, colorful food, everything. And then we are a person, we are like a human being, not only the victim of that wrong policy by a specific government. So it's really good to have those kind of conversations or panel discussions in the universities, but also it will be more powerful to have direct conversation with the Chinese people or the Chinese embassy members, so we can directly get the response about what they think about, especially about my mom. Yeah. Because it's really hard nobody can imagine how I'm going through every single day since the February 6th.
Thank you for sharing that. And I'm so sorry that you're going through that. And I think that is a really great question. I mean, American universities are to educate American students and also Chinese students. So what do you think universities should do to educate Chinese and Americans about both the situation in Xinjiang and the Uyghur people? And then if anyone also wants to talk about the comparison between the party and other horrific regimes, perhaps some that have been quite a lot more horrific than what the party's done recently. Love to hear that.
I'll address the first question. I think you could say it all comes down to one word. So, why was it relatively easy for the United States, let's say, to be so vocal about the crimes of the Soviet Union or North Korea and not China? Then that one word is money. Because the difference is that during the Cold War, our economy was not at all integrated with the Soviet Union or any area behind the Iron Curtain. And so the huge forces of money in our politics and in our society were not mobilized to preserve that source of money. But in the United States today and in Europe, the Chinese government is the source. And not just the government, but access to the economy, access to the Chinese economy is a huge source of wealth for many, 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 many people, and it's a source of power. And if many people want to preserve wealth and they want to preserve power. So access to that Chinese economy or to grants from the Chinese government or whatever, that's controlled by the Chinese government. And for many people, their bottom line is to preserve that. And so it makes it much more difficult to have a more unified conversation about the horrible things that are happening, because you have so many people and you have so much money going into the idea that, no, it's okay, it's actually fine. They lifted hundreds of millions of people out of poverty, including myself. I have a yacht. It's much more difficult. So I'd say that is the main reason it's so difficult. We talk about Tiananmen Massacre, and we talk about the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution and the repression of religious minorities and ethnic minorities. And right now it's happening again, right? Right now the Chinese Communist Party is repeating some of the very worst human rights atrocities that happened in the 20th century, that they promised. They said, we will be different. They promised that. They said they would be different, and they are not. And they're proving it today. And they're proving it through your mother and through a million other people who are in those camps. And it's become very difficult to talk about it because people put money and power first.
I also want to respond to that question. It's related to geopolitics among great powers. It's also related to economic benefit. We talk about Confucius Institute, all these cooperations between Chinese and American institutions. If Chinese government didn't give amount of money, they won't think about to have a Confucius Institute. So like Apple, Google, Yahoo. So all these companies, they want Chinese market, the biggest market, and it's also because of the self-censorship and the Chinese Communist Party's propaganda. We all mentioned that the Chinese government is so skilled at promoting its good image, its own narrative, and then gradually this kind of language narrative will influence American scholars and students and decision makers. Yeah.
Thank you. Got some questions over here. Yes, please.
Hi, I'm a doctoral student from George Mason, and our school have Confucius Institute, and I just submitted a proposal to school about teaching a course on this topic to see how that works. And one American education policy on foreign students doesn't make sense to me is that on one hand, we American recruit Chinese students and with the expectation that they were influenced by American freedom and democracy. But on the other hand, you didn't ask them to take any course about like the U.S. Constitution, like politics. Basically, they have no any formal source of knowledge. But in contrast, they received a very tremendous brainwash inside China before they come here.
What's your question?
I just ask your opinion about this concern.
Great. And then we're going to do one quick question, and then this will be the final response because I think we're past time.
Hi, Katie Wang with NTD TV. My question is about American students and the scholars who are going to China, because nowadays we can see more and more exchange between these two countries. So I talked with one of the former FBI official. He told me that he wanted to talk with one of the local universities, try to give these people, some pre-education or some awareness before they are visiting China, because he thinks the Chinese intelligence is kind of targeting these people as well. Not only Chinese Americans or Chinese students, but also American scholars and students. So, but unfortunately, the university turned him down and said, no, you cannot interfere with our students and scholars. So I want to get your opinion on that. Do you think this public awareness should be, have more, to do more on our campus?
Great. So educating American students about China and also Chinese students about America. So if you want to address that or any other concluding remarks, and minus 30 seconds each.
I'll answer the first question. Unfortunately, in the United States, Common Core requirements in colleges have increasingly gone away. There is no Common Core at most universities that all students take. A certain number of classes that are survey courses. Civics is one of those classes. A couple of states have civics requirements for all students, but most states don't. And so that affects American students who don't know civics for their own country, but it also affects foreign students, you're right, who don't have a good introduction to that. And so I think the students from China and from other nations, they're falling through the cracks of a system that is also failing American students as well, which is the dissolution of the core curriculum.
We could also end on time if people want to, if you just want to call it now. I mean, I think there's a lot of really wonderful things that we all went over.
I'll say one thing about the question before last about why the Western world doesn't react as strongly to Maoist trepidations as it did to Hitler and Stalin and stuff. And all of these, I agree with what my fellow panelists have said. But there's another cultural thing that's kind of vague, but I think it's important. And that's Europe from the 16th, 17th century conceived China as the other side of the world, mysterious, other, different. Voltaire and Leibniz had this idea. Idealizing China sometimes. It's a magical kingdom where everything works well. And then there were others who thought, no, it's a yellow horde, it's a menace. But in both cases, it's far away, it's distance, it's not us. Whereas when a Holocaust happens in Europe or even in Ukraine, there's a big, the ethnic solidarity is just stronger. People take it for granted that, oh, that matters. Whereas, oh, the Chinese, they're way over there. It's a different kind of thing that we almost should respect as a different part of the world. That's why I'm such a big supporter of Human Rights Watch. Is Sophie still here? They're trying to make the point that human beings are human beings are human beings. And these generalizing notions about, oh, that's another kind of human being are passé. I hope they're passé.
One final brief point. Every day there are thousands of seminars, conferences like this, and sometimes the Chinese experts, professors were invited, but often the people who got most invitation are the official scholars or the people from Gongo, the government organized organization, NGOs. So we and the people like us who are critical of Chinese government are kind of marginalized by Chinese Communist Party. So I think it's better to invite these people who tend to tell the truth, who can give you a whole image of China. And if you invite the official scholars, and then they won't tell the whole truth, and sometimes they give you misleading points, and so we should be really aware of that kind of possibility.
Thank you. Well, thank you, panelists. Let's all give everyone a round of applause.